Pinker, author of The Sense of Style, discusses how we can improve the quality of our writing. Professor Pinker says that while texting and the internet are currently blamed for developing bad writing habits, writing well has always been a difficult task. This event was held at Barnes & Noble Booksellers in New York City. It's just over an hour.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Barnes & Noble. I'm pleased to welcome tonight's guest, Professor Steven Pinker from the Department of Psychology at Harvard, here to introduce his new book, The Sense of Style, The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century. His work in cognition and psychology of language has garnered multiple accolades, among them his being named to Foreign Policy's list of 100 global thinkers and Time's the 100 most influential people in the world today. Please join me in welcoming Steven Pinker and The Sense of Style.
Thank you. Why is so much writing so bad? And how can we make it better? Why do we have to decipher so much legalese, like the revocation by these regulations of a provision previously revoked subject to savings does not affect it to the continued operations? Why do we have to endure so much academies, like it is the moment of non-construction, disclosing the absentation of actuality from the concept, in part through its invitation to emphasize in reading the helplessness of its fall into conceptuality? Why is it so hard to set the time on a digital alarm clock? Well, there's no shortage of theories, and the most popular one is captured in this cartoon, where the boss says to the tech writer, "Good start, needs more gibberish." In other words, bad writing is a deliberate choice. Bureaucrats insist on gibberish to evade responsibility. Pasty-faced nerds get their revenge on the girls who turned them down for dates and the jocks who kicked sand in their faces. Pseudo-intellectuals try to bamboozle their readers with highfalutin gobbledygook, concealing the fact that they have nothing to say. Well, I think there's a problem with the bamboozlement theory, though no doubt it applies to some writers some of the time. But in my experience, I know plenty of scholars and scientists who do groundbreaking work on important subjects. They have no need to impress and nothing to hide. Still, their writing stinks. Good people can write bad prose. The other popular theory is that it's digital media that are ruining the language. Google is making us stupid. The digital age stupefies young Americans and jeopardizes our future, says a book called The Dumbest Generation. Twitter is forcing us to think and write in 140 characters. Well, there's, I think, a problem with the dumbest generation theory, too, because it makes a prediction that it was much better before the digital age. And those of you who were around in the 1980s remember what it was like in that decade. That was the decade in which teenagers spoke in fluent paragraphs, bureaucrats wrote in clear prose. Every academic article was a masterpiece in the art of the essay. You remember those days, don't you? Or was it the 70s? The thing is, bad prose has burdened us in every era. In 1961, the commentators on language were saying recent graduates, including those with university degrees, seem to have no mastery of the language at all. Well, maybe it was better earlier in this 20th century, before the advent of television and radio, like in 1917, when they were saying, from every college in the country goes up the cry, our freshmen can't spell, can't punctuate. Every high school is in disrepair because its pupils are so ignorant of the merest rudiments. Well, maybe you have to go back even farther, like the 18th century, when they were saying, our language is degenerating very fast. I begin to fear that it will be impossible to check it. And then there are the ancient grammar police who said, oh, for crying out loud, you never end a sentence with a little birdie. I think a better theory is inspired by one of my favorite sayings by Charles Darwin, that man has an instinctive tendency to speak, as we see in the babble of our young children, whereas no child has an instinctive tendency to bake, brew, or write. Speech is instinctive. Writing is and always has been hard. The reader is unknown, invisible, inscrutable. They exist only in the writer's imagination. The reader can't break in or react or ask for clarification. And so writing is an act of pretense, and writing is an act of craftsmanship. Classic prose gives the reader credit for knowing that many concepts are hard to define and many controversies are hard to resolve. The reader is there to see what the writer's going to do about it. Another corollary in classic prose is to minimize the reflexive hedging that many scholars engage in, the drizzling of prose with little fluffy modifiers like somewhat, fairly, nearly, seemingly, in part, relatively, comparatively, predominantly, to some extent, so to speak, and presumably, which implies that they don't really mean what they are saying. Similarly, many academics tend to overuse shudder quotes. I'll give you an example of a sentence that does both. This comes from a letter of recommendation I read for a candidate for admission to graduate school. She is a quick study and has been able to educate herself in virtually any area that interests her. Now, are we supposed to understand this as saying that this young woman is a quick study, or that she is a quick study, namely someone who is rumored or alleged to be a quick study, but really isn't? And does the virtually any area mean that there are some areas where she tried to educate herself but failed? The use of these hedges has so reflexive, so ingrained among many scholars that at one point I met a eminent scientist, and I asked her how she was. She pulled out a picture of her 4-year-old daughter, and she beamed, "We virtually adore her." Aww. Why is there so much compulsive hedging in academia and also other kinds of professionalese? Well, it's to follow the imperative that bureaucrats abbreviate CYA, cover your anatomy. And there is an alternative credo. So sue me. You state what you mean, and you count on the ordinary charity of conversation that we all engage in to make conversation possible. So if someone says that they want to move out of Seattle because it's a rainy city, you don't interpret them as meaning that it rains in Seattle 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. You automatically interpret it as relatively or somewhat rainy. And so you can count on that in writing classic prose. A second major implication of classic prose is that it has to keep up the illusion that the reader is seeing a world rather than listening to verbiage. And that illusion can be shattered when a writer writes in cliches, leading to the familiar advice, avoid cliches like the plague. And so the kind of writer who writes, "We needed to get the ball rolling in our search for the Holy Grail, but found that it was neither a magic bullet nor a slam dunk, so we rolled with the punches and let the chips fall where they may while seeing the glass as half full," which is easier said than done. Well, as you process this prose, you clearly have to turn off your visual cortex, or else you get one ludicrous image after another. Especially since the overuse of cliches will inevitably lead writers to mix their metaphors, as in another sentence from a letter of recommendation I received. Jeff is a Renaissance man drilling down to the core issues and pushing the envelope. Not clear how you can do all three of those at the same time. Or no one has yet invented a condom that will knock people's socks off. A related hazard of writing in cliches, or at least not thinking of the visual content of what you write, is that you would be eligible for membership in AWFUL, that is, Americans who figuratively use literally. So there's nothing wrong with saying she literally blushed. It's not so good to say she literally exploded. And it's very, very bad to say she literally emasculated him. Third, classic prose is about the world, not about the conceptual tools with which we understand the world. And therefore, it calls for minimizing the use of meta-concepts. These are concepts about other concepts like approach, assumption, concept, condition, context, framework, issue-level model, perspective, process, role, strategy, tendency, and variable. And anyone who has read bureaucratic or academic prose is all too familiar with these filler words. For example, this is from an editorial in the New York Times by a legal scholar who wrote, "I have serious doubts that trying to amend the Constitution would work on an actual level. On the aspirational level, however, a constitutional amendment strategy may be more valuable, which means I doubt that trying to amend the Constitution would actually succeed, but it may be valuable to aspire to it." Or, "It is important to approach the subject from a variety of strategies, including the mental health assistance, but also from a law enforcement perspective, to which we need to consult psychiatrists, but we may also have to inform the police." Classic prose narrates ongoing events. We see agents performing actions that affect objects. Non-classic prose thingifies events and then refers to them using a pernicious grammatical process called nominalization, turning something into a noun or a name. So instead of talking about someone appearing, you say they make an appearance. Instead of organizing something, you bring about the organization of that thing. The English scholar Helen Sword calls them zombie nouns because they lumber across the stage without any conscious agent directing their motion. And they can turn prose into a Night of the Living Dead. Example. This is from an experimental paper in psycholinguistics. Participants read assertions whose veracity was either affirmed or denied by the subsequent presentation of an assessment word, which means people saw a sentence on a screen followed by the word true or false. Subjects were tested under conditions of good to excellent acoustic isolation, to which we tested the students in a quiet room. The use of metaconcepts and zombie nouns has become such a signature of academies that everyone can recognize the humor behind this editorial cartoon from Tom Tolles, where a bearded academician is explaining the reason that verbal SAT scores are at an all-time low. Incomplete implementation of strategized programmatics designated to maximize acquisition of awareness and utilization of communication skills pursuant to standardized review and assessment of languaginal development. Any interrogatory verbalizations? It's not just academics who are tempted by zombie nouns. It's also politicians, as when Governor Rick Perry of Texas said, right now there is not any anticipation that there will be a cancellation. That is, right now we don't anticipate that we will have to cancel it. And corporate consultants, as in the man who explained what he did for a living by saying, "I am a digital and social media strategist. I deliver programs, products, and strategies to our corporate clients across the spectrum of communications functions." And when a journalist pressed him to explain what that means, he finally confessed, "I teach big companies how to use Facebook." And product engineers. It used to be that if you would buy a consumer product like a portable generator, it would come with a warning such as this: mild exposure to CO can result in accumulated damage over time. Extreme exposure to CO may rapidly be fatal without producing significant warning symptoms. Yeah. Well, it turns out that hundreds of people asphyxiated themselves every year by using portable generators indoors, and so they changed the sticker to read, "Using a generator indoors can kill you in minutes." That is classic style. And what it means is that non-classic style can literally be a matter of life and death. Yes, literally be a matter of life and death. Okay, I promised that a better understanding of the design of language can lead to sounder writing advice. How might that work? Well, let's take another contributor to zombie prose, the passive voice. The difference between the dog bit the man, a sentence in the active voice, and the man was bitten by the dog, a sentence in the passive voice. Now, it's well known that the passive is overused by academics. On the basis of the analysis which was made of the data which were collected, it is suggested that the null hypothesis can be rejected. And lawyers, if the outstanding balance is prepaid in full, the unearned finance charge will be refunded. 3 passives in a row. And political officials. You may all recognize the recently resigned director of the Secret Service, Julia Pearson, who, in trying to explain how it is that on her watch an armed intruder vaulted the fence to the White House, sprinted across the lawn, managed to get into the White House armed with a knife before he was finally tackled. Well, she said, mistakes were made. What linguists call the evasive passive. And accordingly, all the classic style guides advise against using the passive voice. As Strunk and White put it, use the active voice. The active voice is usually more direct and vigorous than the passive. Many a tame sentence can be made lively and emphatic by substituting a transitive in the active voice for some perfunctory expression as there is or could be heard. Now, do you know something a little fishy about this advice? It uses the passive voice to tell people not to use the passive voice. Similarly, the other iconic body of advice for writing handed out to every college freshman is George Orwell's Politics of the English Language, in which he says, a mixture of vagueness and sheer incompetence is the most marked characteristic of modern English prose. I list below various of the tricks by means of which the work of prose construction is habitually dodged. The passive voice is wherever possible used in preference to the active, which contains not one but 2 examples of the passive voice. Now, the passive voice, and for that matter any English construction, could not have survived in the language for 1,500 years unless it was doing something useful. And indeed, as these 2 bits of self-contradictory advice remind us, we really can't do without it. And why is that? Well, to understand it, you have to think about the design of language, how language works. And in a nutshell, language can be thought of as an app for converting a web of knowledge into a string of words. That is, the writer's knowledge is what cognitive psychologists model as a semantic network. You can think of it as a mind-wide web. This is a simplified portion of a person's knowledge of the tragedy of Oedipus Rex as brought to life by Sophocles. It has a number of concepts and images and snatches of melody, all interconnected by various conceptual and logical relationships. When you daydream, your mind can flit from concept to concept in pretty much any order. But when it comes time to share a chunk of this network with another person, you've got to convert it into a sentence. What is a sentence? It is a linear string of words. In Sophocles' play, Oedipus married his mother and killed his father, one word after another. This means that there is an inherent problem in the design of language. The order of words in a sentence has to do 2 things at once. On the one hand, it serves as the code for meaning. It indicates who did what to whom. At the same time, it necessarily presents some bits of information to the reader before others, and thus affects how the information is absorbed into the mind of the reader. The early material in the sentence is the sentence topic. It refers to what the reader is, in a sense, looking at. It's the given information. Because it connects back to what the reader is already thinking about. The later material in the sentence is the focus of the sentence. It presents the new information. It's analogous to what you notice once you're looking in a particular direction. Any prose that violates these principles will have a feeling of being choppy or disjointed or incoherent. Enter the passive voice. The passive is a workaround for this flaw or design contradiction in language. It allows writers to convey the same semantic information, namely who did what to whom, but while flipping the surface order. In particular, it allows a writer to start the sentence with the done to instead of the doer. And that is why avoid the passive is bad advice. The passive is actually the better construction when the done to is currently the focus of the reader's mental gaze. And again, I will illustrate this with an example. I'm going to give you a passage from the Wikipedia entry for Oedipus Rex, which describes the epiphany that begins the climax of the play. Spoiler alert. A messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time he was given a baby. The baby, he says, was given to him by another shepherd from the Laius household who had been told to get rid of the child. Now notice that this pretty understandable passage has three passive constructions in a row. First, our eyes are on the messenger. The first sentence says, a messenger arrives from Corinth. And so the messenger is the subject of the sentence, he was given a baby. Well, now our eyes are on the baby. And so the next sentence uses a passive where the baby is the subject. The baby was given to the messenger by another shepherd. Well, now our eyes are on the other shepherd, and so he is the subject of the sentence. The other shepherd had been told to get rid of the child. That's why this passage is reasonably easy to follow. Now imagine the writer had followed the advice, convert passives to actives. You would get a messenger arrives from Corinth. It emerges that he was formerly a shepherd on Mount Kithaeron, and during that time someone gave him a baby. Another shepherd from the Laius household, he says, whom someone had told to get rid of a child, gave the baby to him. Now this is much harder to follow because you feel like you're kind of at a tennis match, kind of looking back and forth at the different participants. A well-crafted passage is like the careful choice of camera angles by a cinematographer, and the passive is one of the means by which that can be accomplished. More generally, English syntax provides writers with constructions that vary the order of the string of words while preserving the meaning. You could write Oedipus killed Laius, Laius was killed by Oedipus, it was Laius whom Oedipus killed, it was Oedipus who killed Laius, and so on. And the challenge for writers is to choose the construction that introduces ideas to the reader in the order in which she can best absorb them. Well, this does bring up the question of why the passive is so common in bad writing, which it indeed is. The reason is that good writers narrate a story which is advanced by protagonists who make things happen. Bad writers work backward from their own knowledge, just writing down ideas in the order in which they occur to them. The writer knows how the story turned out, so the writer begins with the outcome of the event and then throws in the cause as an afterthought, and the passive voice makes that all too easy. Well, that bad habit of writers leads to the third part of this talk, namely, why is it so hard for writers to use language to convey ideas? The best explanation that I know of is a phenomenon in psychology called the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge works as follows. When you know something, it is extraordinarily difficult to imagine what it's like for someone else not to know it. Also called mind blindness, egocentrism, hindsight bias. There are probably half a dozen other phenomena in psychology that involve the same blind spot. A classic experimental illustration is a study done on 3-year-old children, familiar to any developmental psychology student. 3-year-old comes into the lab. You give him a box of M&Ms. He opens the box and he's surprised to find ribbons inside. So you put the ribbons back in the box. You close it up. Now a new child comes into the lab, say Jason, and you ask the boy, what does Jason think is in the box? And the child will say, ribbons. Even though, of course, Jason has no way of knowing that the box contains ribbons. The child knows the box contains ribbons, and he can't help but think that everyone else knows it too. In fact, if you ask the child, what did you think was in the box when you came into the lab, the child will say, ribbons. Now, adults, of course, outgrow this kind of error, kinda. Because many studies have shown that adults are prone to a version of the same impairment. If a person knows the meaning of an obscure word, they assume that everyone else knows it. If they know a fact, they assume other people know it. If they know how to use a cell phone, they assume that everyone else can learn it very quickly as well. And I think the curse of knowledge is the chief contributor to opaque writing, that it simply doesn't occur to a writer that they need to spell out the abbreviations, define the technical terms, avoid the jargon, use concrete language that allows the reader to imagine something as opposed to abstractions that will be meaningless to the reader. And there is a well-studied cognitive process that leads people into this impairment. As you develop expertise in a subject, you start to package larger and larger bodies of information into a single unit, which cognitive psychologists call a chunk. You can label the chunk with a noun phrase and call it to mind in an instant. Now, this undoubtedly makes complicated thinking possible. On the other hand, it will necessarily leave out someone who has not undergone the same history of chunking. So imagine, just as an example, the phenomenon that I just explained, namely people have trouble imagining what it's like not to know something that they know. I introduced the label, the curse of knowledge, and now when I say the curse of knowledge, you know what I'm referring to. Likewise, I described the M&M's experiment, which psychologists call the false belief task. Again, a phrase that refers to a complicated scenario. Well, then the expert will tend to refer to the event with a label for the chunk, forgetting that readers never underwent the same learning process. So if I were to explain how the curse of knowledge leads to bad writing by simply saying writers suffer from the curse of knowledge, similar to children's behavior in the false belief task, I know what I'm talking about, but if I hadn't explained it and people forget to explain it, you'd have no idea what I'm talking about. And this phenomenon, I think, belies the common excuse among professionals that they have to use technical vocabulary to communicate efficiently with their peers, and so they can't be blamed if their writing is opaque to others. Lots of text that is directed at me, articles in my own field, subfield, sometimes sub-subfield, I find utterly incomprehensible. For example, this is from an article on consciousness in a journal called Trends in Cognitive Science, written for the likes of me, which the authors explain the slow and integrative nature of conscious perception is confirmed behaviorally by observations such as the rabbit illusion and its variants, where the way in which a stimulus is ultimately perceived is influenced by post-stimulus events arising hundreds of milliseconds after the original stimulus. Well, the authors assumed that everyone knows what the rabbit illusion is, but I've been in this business for almost 40 years, and I had never heard of it. So likewise, they assumed that it's obvious what a stimulus is and what perceived is and so on. I could kind of vaguely nodded as I read this, but I really couldn't claim to have understood it. So I did some digging. I looked in my shelves. I found out that there is a phenomenon called the cutaneous rabbit illusion that works as follows. You have someone close their eyes, then you tap them 3 times on the wrist, 3 times on the elbow, 3 times on the shoulder, and it feels to them like a series of taps running up the length of their arm, kind of like a hopping rabbit. The significance is that your perception of where the early taps were felt depends on where the later taps were. So consciousness doesn't unfold in real time, but it's kind of edited retroactively. Well, okay, why didn't they just say that? There is nothing that is more precise or scientific or rigorous about a stimulus compared to a tap on the wrist, or a post-stimulus event compared to a tap on the elbow. Indeed, it is less rigorous and less scientific because someone reading this passage is in no position to evaluate their argument and to assess whether this really does show that conscious perception is slow or integrative. Whereas if you know what actually happened, which you would know if it was expressed in concrete, plain English, then you would be in a position to evaluate it. My favorite illustration of the general phenomenon of the curse of knowledge comes from an old joke in which a man goes into the dining room of a Catskills resort and he sees a bunch of retired Borscht Belt comedians sitting around a table. And he joins them, and hears one of them saying, 117, and then the rest of them burst out in uproarious laughter. Another one says, 36, again, general hilarity. He can't figure out what's going on. So he asks the guy next to him, what's going on here? The guy says, well, you see, these old-timers have been around each other so long that they all know the same jokes. And so to save time, they give each joke a number, and then they don't have to tell the joke, they can just recite the number. The guy says, that's ingenious, let me try it. So he stands up and he says, 47. Stony silence. 112. Everyone stared at him, no one laughed. So he kind of sinks back into his seat and he asks his companion, what did I do wrong? Why didn't anyone laugh? He says, well, it's all in the way you tell it. Well, that's an illustration of the curse of knowledge. Now, how do you exercise the curse of knowledge? Well, the traditional advice is to keep in mind the reader over your shoulder. Try to imagine what your readers know and don't know. The problem with the traditional solution is that we're not very good at guessing other people's knowledge. We do not have the gift of clairvoyance. Even when we try hard, we're not so good at it. And we're deluded about how much we really can infer about other people's knowledge. But at least it's a start, so for what it's worth, hey, I'm talking to you. Your readers know less than you think they do, and unless you try to imagine what they know, you're guaranteed to confuse them. But a better solution is to show a draft to a real reader and see if they can follow it. And you will often find that what is obvious to you is not obvious to anyone else. In addition, show a draft to yourself after enough time has passed that it isn't familiar. If you're like me, in rereading your first draft, you'll constantly find yourself saying, what did I mean by that? This doesn't follow. And all too often, who wrote this crap? Most advice on writing should be thought of as advice on how to revise, not how to write, because the order and nature in which thoughts occur to a writer is rarely the same as the way in which they're best absorbed by a reader. Finally, how do we think about correct usage? Probably the aspect of writing that gets the most attention. Whenever I speak about writing, say on the radio and their call-ins, the switchboards always light up with people's peeves about incorrect usage. Well, it's clear that there are some usages that are obviously wrong. When Cookie Monster says, "Me want cookie," the humor appreciated even by a child comes from the fact that we all, including children, realize that Cookie Monster has made a grammatical error. ICANN has cheeseburger. Ditto. It would not be funny to the extent that it is unless we all recognize that cats don't speak in grammatical English. Is our children learning? Even former President George W. Bush acknowledged that this was an error in a self-deprecating speech in which he went over a number of his grammatical gaffes. There are others that are not so clear. Just to be nonpartisan, former President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, when he was running for president in 1992, one of his taglines was, "Give Al Gore and I a chance to bring America back," which many sticklers would say contains a grammatical error, the infamous "between you and I" error. Another Democratic president, Barack Obama, recently said, "No American should live under a cloud of suspicion just because of what they look like." There are members of the Gotcha Gang, the grammar police, who would say that that is an error of number agreement, the singular they error. That is, that the error is that the plural they is has as its antecedent the singular no American. To boldly go where no man has gone before. Is this a grammatical error? The split infinitive? Many would say so. You think you lost your love? Well, I saw her yesterday. It's you she's thinking of, and she told me what to say. This has a preposition at the end of the sentence, and a grammatical pedant would say that they ought to have sung, "It's you of whom she's thinking." And then there is the suave, urbane, articulate 1970s talk show host Dick Cavett, who recently wrote an article for the New York Times speaking about his college reunion, in which he said, "Checking into the hotel, it was nice to see a few of my old classmates in the lobby." Anyone? Dangling modifier or dangling participle. This is someone who clearly went to school before the 1960s. Usages like this have led to what some journalists call the language war, according to which there are two different approaches to usage. There are the prescriptivists and the descriptivists. The prescriptivists prescribe how people ought to speak. Their position can be summarized that rules of usage are objectively correct. To obey them is to uphold standards of excellence. To flout them is to dumb down literate culture and hasten the decline of civilization. No joke, they actually say this. The descriptivists describe how people do speak, and their position, according to this dichotomy, can be summed up as rules of usage are the secret handshake of the ruling class. The people should be liberated to write however they please. Now, I think there are a lot of reasons to think that the language war is a pseudo-controversy ginned up by the New Yorker 60 years ago. If there really was this sharp divide, then the prescriptivists would insist that the Beatles should have sung "It's you of whom she's thinking," and the descriptivists would find nothing wrong with "I can has cheeseburger." Clearly, we need a better way of thinking about usage. What are rules of usage? Well, they are not an objective fact about the world that a scientist can go out and measure with an instrument. They are certainly not logical or mathematical truths that you could prove the way you prove a theorem. Many people think that they are stipulated by certain governing bodies, those behind dictionaries. Well, I can speak with some authority here. I am the chair of the usage panel of the American Heritage Dictionary, and the first thing I did when they signed me up is I asked the editors of the dictionary, "How do you guys decide what goes into a dictionary?" And they said, "We pay attention to the way people use words." In other words, when it comes to English, there's no one in charge. The lunatics are running the asylum. Dictionaries do not consist of a cabal of experts who meet around a table once a year and stipulate what is correct or incorrect. It's not like the Rules Committee of Major League Baseball, but rather they codify the practices of current speakers of English. The way to think about rules of usage, then, is that they are tacit, evolving conventions. A convention is a way of doing things that has no inherent advantage other than the fact that everyone else does it the same way. Paper currency is an obvious example. There's nothing valuable about a green piece of paper with George Washington on it, other than the fact that everyone else treats it as if it was valuable. There's no particular advantage to driving on the right. In England, they get by with driving on the left, but there is, of course, an advantage to everyone agreeing to drive on one side or the other. Again, there's a joke about a commuter on the way to work who gets a call from his wife on his cell phone, and his wife says, "Honey, be very careful. I've been listening to the radio, and they said there's a maniac driving on the wrong side of the freeway." And he said, "One maniac? There are hundreds of them." The conventions of language, unlike paper currency or the law of which side of the street to drive on, is tacit. It emerges as a rough consensus within a virtual community of careful writers without explicit deliberation, agreement, or legislation, and it's evolving. This rough consensus inevitably changes over time. Well, then, what should a writer do? The answer is that rules of usage should be evaluated. Some are worth following, others are not. The clear case in which one should follow a rule is when it simply extends the logic of everyday grammar to more complicated cases. So why do all of us, including George W. Bush, agree that "is our children learning" violates a rule? It's because it's simply an inverted version of our children is learning, and everyone recognizes that that's ungrammatical. Therefore, it's only consistency that would say, is our children learning, is also ungrammatical. Or the impact of the cuts have not been felt yet. That can easily glide past the reader's eye, but when you think about it, it really should be the impact of the cuts has not been felt yet. The writer here was misled by the plural noun cuts that's adjacent to the verb have, whereas the subject of the sentence is actually the singular word impact, and you could appreciate that if you simply take out the intervening words and you get the impact have not been felt yet. Everyone agrees that that's an error. Therefore, the impact of the cuts have not been felt yet is also an error. Now, by the way, many of you might recognize the infamous green wiggly line of Microsoft Word. I have found that a majority of the green wiggly lines flag agreement errors like this that may have escaped the eye of the writer, but which Word is actually pretty good at detecting. Also, there are some prescriptive rules that make important semantic distinctions. Full and fulsome do not mean the same thing, and if you use fulsome as because you think it's a fancy schmancy synonym of full, you might get into trouble. Fulsome means excessively flattering, insincere, and so if you thank someone for their fulsome letter or their fulsome introduction, you will be insulting that person and yourself. Likewise, to call something simplistic is not the same as calling it simple. Calling it simple might be a compliment. Calling it simplistic would be an insult. It means excessively simple or naive. Fortunate and fortuitous, among careful writers, don't mean the same thing. And it's a good idea if you want to refer to something being meritorious that you don't call it meretricious. You can look it up and find out why. The general rule is that English rarely tolerates synonyms consisting of the same root and different suffixes. Avoid the temptation of sounding hoity-toity by using a highfalutin word that you think is a more posh version of a simple word. This is another case in which it really does make sense to obey the prescriptive rules in order to meet the expectations of your readership. Otherwise, you might be subject to the declaration of Inigo Montoya in The Princess Bride after Vizzini repeatedly used the word inconceivable to refer to things that just happened. He says, "You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means." On the other hand, not every pet peeve, bit of grammatical folklore, or dimly remembered lesson from Miss Thistlebottom's classroom is a legitimate rule of usage. And many of the alleged rules out there, in fact, violate grammatical logic, are routinely flouted by the best writers, have always been flouted by the best writers. A prime example being singular they. In an article called Everyone Loves Their Jane Austen, the English scholar Henry Churchyard documents that Jane Austen used singular they no fewer than 87 times in her prose. Likewise, split infinitives, dangling participles between you and I, all the best writers in the history of English literature have used them. Indeed, it's not only unnecessary to obey many of the rules that are floating out there, but obeying them can actually make your prose worse. For example, take this sentence that came in a Harvard press release. David Rockefeller has pledged $100 million to increase dramatically learning opportunities for Harvard undergraduates. Now, I don't know what language this is, but it isn't English. What happened here is that the writer tried so hard to avoid a split infinitive that he moved dramatically after the verb and resulted in something close to gibberish. Even more dramatically, in January 2009, as Chief Justice John Roberts, who is a notorious stickler for grammar, was administering the oath of office, the oath of office, according to the Constitution, reads as follows, I, Barack Obama, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. Roberts, administering the oath without notes, changed it to, "I, Barack Obama, do solemnly swear that I will execute the office of President of the United States faithfully." Now, by the way, this is not an improvement in terms of prose style, this desperate attempt to avoid a split verb. And also, it called into question the legitimacy of the transition of power, and so they had to repeat the oath of office, split verb and all, in a private ceremony later that afternoon. If you thought the birthers would cause trouble, just imagine if Barack Obama had never been administered the exact wording of the oath of office. This is the kind of mischief that can result if you take many of these rules too seriously. Well, how should a reader distinguish legitimate should be a writer distinguish legitimate rules of usage from the bogus ones? The answer is unbelievably simple. Look them up. Modern dictionaries and style manuals will not back up any cockamamie theory, rumor, bubamisa, superstition, folklore that the various purists will throw at you, because modern dictionaries and style manuals actually pay close attention to the way English actually is written. They are evidence-based. If you look up split infinitive in, say, Merriam-Webster's Unabridged Dictionary, it will say, "It's all right to split an infinitive in the interest of clarity. Since clarity is the usual reason for splitting, this advice means merely that you can split them whenever you need to." American Heritage Dictionary, "The only rationale for condemning the construction is based on a false analogy with Latin. In general, the usage panel accepts the split infinitive." Encarta, Random House, etc., 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 you actually cannot find a reputable guide on style that actually says don't split an infinitive, yet everyone thinks that somewhere someone wrote down that rule. So modern, and in fact, it's not only split infinitives, but look it up. Dictionaries and style manuals do not ban singular they, prepositions at the end of sentences, dangling modifiers, and so on. It's the difference between reasoned evidence-based usage advice versus smarty pants one-upmanship, and a lot of advice on grammar consists of one-upmanship. Also, correct usage should be kept in perspective. I think it's well worth paying attention to, but it's the least important part of good writing. You can obey every rumored or alleged rule of usage and still write lousy prose. It's far less important than classic style, than overcoming the curse of knowledge, to say nothing of factual diligence and coherent ideas and arguments. And even the most irksome errors, the ones that really make your skin crawl, are not signs of the decline of language, to say nothing of civilization. As the webcomic and now best-selling author Randall Munroe showed in his XKCD comic, he imagines a purist being visited by a ghost who brings a cautionary vision of things to come. This is the future. And this is the future if you give up the fight over the word literally. And yes, they're exactly the same. So in sum, I think modern linguistics and cognitive science provide better ways of enhancing our prose. A model of prose communication, namely classic style or language as a window onto the world. An understanding of the way that language works, namely a means of converting a web of thoughts into a string of words. A diagnosis of why good prose is so hard to write, namely the curse of knowledge. And a way to make sense of rules of correct usage, namely as tacit evolving conventions. Any interrogatory verbalizations? Thank you. Okay, we've got a man with a boom mic who's going to find the questioners. Yes? If you just wait a second until the microphone finds you. Over here. Okay. You got a question?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Well, it's kind of comment. You're talking about the illogic in punctuation.
The illogic in punctuation,
yeah. Right. And you give a very great example of a sentence about Richard III where the quotation is used and the full stop should be outside the quotation mark because the whole thing isn't a quotation. But it does actually, and then you do say that some American printer way back had this crazy idea that, but actually in considering how much you talk about design in language figuratively, the design of language literally or in concrete terms is to hang the quotation marks for visual reasons only. Like if you see the back of your book, the blurbs, all the quotation marks are in the margin.
Mm-hmm.
That's just for visual reasons. I say that as a New York Times art director.
Oh, yes.
But really, it is.
Yes.
I mean, it's not logical conceptually.
It's visual, yes.
But it really, and that has a logic of its own. That's all I'm saying.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So what we're referring to is the American style of punctuation. This is not followed in the United Kingdom, in which if a sentence ends with quoted material, then American practice is to put the period or comma inside the quotation marks rather than outside. So if you say he called her a quote quick study unquote, the period goes before the closing quotation mark in the United States. Now this sticks in the craw of every linguist and logician and computer scientist because it is patently illogical. The quoted material is a part of the sentence and the full stop demarcates the end of the sentence. And so the way I put it is that the putting them in that order is like the Superman's famous wardrobe malfunction in which he wears his underwear outside his pants. Now, yes, but the reason...
But it isn't for that reason. It is,
No. Yes, so it couldn't be for that
flush
reason.
left. They're all flush left, and
It couldn't be for that reason because it makes no sense.
Right.
And but yes, the original rationale was visual, namely, someone decided that it looks better not to have a period with all of that, out there naked with all that white space around it. Well, it looks better if you have grown up getting used to it. It's not so clear that in the UK, where they've done perfectly well with the logical punctuation, that it ever pops out to them. And in fact, in certain tech-friendly platforms, most notably Wikipedia, the practice is to use the logical punctuation or the English style, where the period or the comma goes inside the quotation marks. So the question is, when people read Wikipedia, does it look ugly when you have that period outside the quotation mark? I suspect few people have even noticed. Now, granted, if you're a trained typographer, if you kind of live in the world of type, then I can maybe see the aesthetics. Although even then, I kind of wonder if it's just a lifetime of having seen it that way. It's not that ugly that one would necessarily want to tolerate the illogic of it. So I'm not going to be able to change American typographical practice single-handedly. The example that you referred to from an article called Punctuation and Human Freedom by Geoffrey Pullum, the British linguist, came up with examples in which the American practice makes it impossible to express certain precise thoughts. And so he called for a campaign of civil disobedience. Defy your copy editors, which, and this was almost 30 years before Wikipedia actually followed his practice and insisted on logical punctuation. But anyway, you are correct in noting that this bit of illogic is done for visual aesthetic reasons rather than grammatical logic. It's one of many examples, by the way, that I talk about there's a section in punctuation where I note that many errors that seem to betray a writer as being illiterate don't come from a lack of logic. On the contrary, they come from being too logical, while betraying a lack of attention to details of the printed page. And things like using the so-called grocer's apostrophe, like, apples 99 cents each, where apples is spelled apple apostrophe S. That's actually pretty logical, but it's just not the way it's done. Or it's right edge, where it Its has the apostrophe S, the possessive. That's extremely logical, but again, we just don't do it that way. And so if you're a careful writer, you have to pay enough attention to the details that you remember all the bits of illogic. And this is another one. Yes, you have a question? Yeah, yes, you.
I'm a high school English teacher in South Africa, and
Yes.
a lot of my students are not first language English speakers. And we have a continual debate in our department about the best way to teach good writing. The one side of the debate is to favor teaching students to be able to analyze the structure of a sentence. So if I'm trying to explain to my students why they've constructed it incorrectly, I can use certain kinds of jargon so that I can point it out to them. The other side of the debate is that that's kind of a colonial, pedantic activity. And what we should rather be doing with limited time is just exposing our students to good writing and giving them practice writing. And obviously the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but with limited time resources, I'm constantly confused about what I should be doing.
Yes, yes. So this was a debate that played out in the United States in the 1960s, and it has led to the third major theory about why there is so much bad writing out there, namely kids aren't taught to diagram sentences anymore, and not like the good old days when we were kids. And indeed, the practice of diagramming sentences has fallen out of fashion in American education, though it's still a matter of debate in South Africa. There are a number of studies that show that getting kids to diagram sentences does not improve the quality of their writing. And I'm kind of loath to admit it because I actually like the idea of teaching grammar. And in one of the chapters of the book, I kind of try to revive the lost art of diagramming sentences, not with the Kellogg-Reed notation that was taught from the 1890s to the 1960s, but with a kind of notation that modern linguists use, which I think is much more transparent. I suspect, given that the data are the data, and they do suggest that this is probably not the best way to teach writing, that I suspect that grammatical analysis is probably best reserved for later stages in education, in high school and college. I think it is a subject worth teaching simply because it allows you to absorb advice on writing. It's very hard, and I found it impossible, to diagnose and repair convoluted sentences without being able to say subordinate clause or relative clause, or to use terms like adjective and modifier. As with any technical subject, you need to learn a little bit of vocabulary, in cooking, in photography, in bicycling, and if someone doesn't know what an adjective is, it's going to be very hard to give them explicit advice on writing. Also, I think that modern syntactic theory is a fascinating subject in its own right. Rather than just being a bunch of rules that you have to obey because the teacher said so, I think it can be taught as a branch of science, namely, what is the system by which human beings share their thoughts by means of words? And if you think of it as an empirical subject, like what are the ways of, if you don't know, of distinguishing an adjective from a preposition? Or a modifier from an adjunct, and you do little experiments with the words, I think you get a deeper insight as to how to analyze a sentence grammatically. But it probably isn't what you should do at the start, especially in elementary school, where indeed practice at writing, the kind of tacit knowledge that writers have to develop, and just as important, immersion in reading. You can't write unless you've done a lot of reading. There are just so many idioms, so many vocabulary items, so many arbitrary quirks like punctuation that you can absorb only by immersion in the world of text, that and practice of writing, I think, should be primary, with lessons on grammar coming later, almost like a branch of science. Over there in the back.
I was curious, do you have for yourself sort of either personally or professionally, kind of a tipping point with regard to usage as to when you feel it's okay to use like the evolved meaning of a word? I'm thinking of words like hopefully or nauseous, or literally sort of seems to be the perfect one to use right now.
Yes, so the question is there some dividing line or tipping point as to when a construction that starts out as frowned upon by the purists, but just becomes entrenched by use and starts becoming unexceptionable? At what point do you throw in the towel and say, well, everyone uses it that way, I may as well use it that way too? Well, that's largely what modern dictionaries are for, and why they are updated every decade or so, and why in many dictionaries, such as the American Heritage Dictionary, cases that are either in transition or have always evoked controversy have usage notes attached to them. So instead of, as chair of the usage panel, I'm partly responsible for gathering the data among a sample of writers, of journalists, essayists, poets, novelists, scientists, linguists, where we poll them once a year with problematic usages or disputed usages, and we report in usage notes what the consensus, if there is one, is. In cases where the votes are divided down the middle, we tell readers that, and so that they can use their best judgment, being able to anticipate the reaction that they're likely to get. In some cases, it's just purely generational. It's been said of science that science advances funeral by funeral. And the same is true of the English language. People grow up who wince at the use of hopefully to mean let's all hope that, as opposed to in a hopeful manner. To contact, I don't know if there's anyone in this room who perceives to contact as a newfangled slang term. So as the generation that finds a term to be objectionable dies, then it can be perfectly acceptable. In other cases, you've got to consider who you're writing for. If you are writing for in a more formal context, there are certain conventions that you'd be wise to follow. In more casual settings, you can get away with looser usage. But the overall framework is to be mindful of the expectations of your readers, because that's really the only authority. So in the case of the correct meaning of nauseous, now I don't know how many of you realize that there's a controversy over the meaning of nauseous. So according to less than a quarter. According to a stickler's rule, nauseous may only be used to mean nauseating. It may not be used to mean nauseated. So, right, we tried the nauseous roller coaster ride. Wrong, after trying the roller coaster ride, we were nauseous. Now, this is that's the way the language used to be spoken, but it has, that horse has left the barn, and very few people will actually interpret nauseous as meaning causing nausea. And indeed, the dictionaries now reflect that. If you use nauseous in the so-called correct sense, you're going to confuse your readers. I liken it to the sketch in Monty Python's Flying Circus, in which someone is arrested for selling a Hungarian English phrase book that translates, can you show me the way to the train station as will you fondle my buttocks? So if you were to have a dictionary that were to define nauseous only as causing nausea, it would be as useless as that Hungarian English phrase book. It would be confusing, and that's of course why dictionaries do update themselves, and other than trusting your ear, consulting a dictionary is the best way to make such judgments. Just a couple more questions?
Maybe just one fast
one. Who's had their hand up the longest? Several? Okay, that gentleman there.
Said it depends who you're writing for. Should it be whom you're writing for?
It would be. I have a whole section on who versus whom, and whom is kind of circling the drain in English. There are many circumstances in which whom, even if it is called for by the rule that says whom is used in accusative contexts, namely when it's the object of a verb or a preposition, and who is used in nominative contexts, namely when it is the subject of the clause. In practice, if you were to follow that rule, you would be an insufferable pedant. You'd be saying things like, do you know whom you're talking to? And whom are you going to call? Ghostbusters? And in fact, careful writers going back to Shakespeare and earlier have used who in contexts that technically might call for whom. So much depends on the level of formality. That is, there are styles of writing that are appropriate, say, for the inscription on a genocide memorial. There you want to use the most careful and formal style that you can. On the other hand, if you're writing an email to a close friend, or if you're having a conversation, you follow those same conventions, and you're going to sound pompous, stuffy, like a pedant. And much of traditional advice confuses the two notions of formality and grammatical correctness, and stipulate that the more formal construction is the only one that's correct, whereas often both are correct, but they're appropriate to different styles. And using the wrong style in either direction, a formal style when an informal one is called for, or vice versa, are both grammatical errors. And whom, except as the object of a preposition, no one would say to who it may concern. But other than that context, whom is appropriate only in more formal styles of speech and writing.
Who the bell's toll for.
Yeah, who the bell tolls for, or for who the bell tolls. There, it's an object of a preposition, and so it obviously clashes even in an informal style. And I give a number of examples in the book of informal emails that indeed do use whom, always as the object of a preposition. But if one were to follow that rule and use it consistently, which, by the way, no one does, even the language pedants, you can catch every one of them using who where their own rules would call for whom, simply because if you have an ear for the language, you will not use whom in every accusative context. You'll just sound way too pompous and formal. I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much.